I'm going to talk to you about perhaps the most exhaustingly used word in the US policy towards Iran currently, which is sanctions. We hear this word so much with various descriptors, including crippling, targeted, smart, comprehensive, economic, but we rarely get a full package or understanding, an analysis of what drives sanctions policy, what the sanctions themselves actually look like, and what the consequences or destruction of sanctions policy can actually be. Lost in government negotiations of these sanctions are often considered invaluable, or the ordinary people they affect. It is our hope that in pushing past the political agendas and posturing of governments, we can find a place to stand beside our Iranian counterparts against policies like sanctions and war. As many of you know, Iran and the US have had no diplomatic relations since 1980, causing a vast chasm of mistrust and misunderstanding over 30 years between these two countries. It is within this context that we're told US diplomacy is carried out in good faith. The fact is, however, that for 30 years, the government has dealt with Iran through policies of isolation and sanctions. While the US has sanctioned Iran since the 1979 revolution, the escalation of sanctions over the last 8 years has rhetorically been aimed at Iran's nuclear program. Since 2006, there have been 4 resolutions from the United Nations Security Council authorizing bans of exports of nuclear, missile, and dual-use technologies, limiting travel of dozens of Iranian officials, freezing of assets. Simultaneously, the United Nations and European Union have independently imposed a wide range of sanctions, from financial dealings to freezing of assets, sanctioning refined gasoline, targeting entities and individuals, targeting banking systems, shipping lines, and energy companies. Threatening to go into effect in just a few weeks is an oil embargo by the European Union. Again, most of these restrictions and sanctions are done in the name of targeting Iran's nuclear program. Iran has vehemently claimed that it solely seeks a civilian nuclear energy program. The security alarm set forth primarily by the US, Israel, France, and the UK has been that a nuclear-capable Iran will set off an arms race in the region, creating an even more volatile Middle East. This dance between Iran's alleged nuclear threats and sanctions is frankly exhausting. Just 2 days ago, Iranian and International Atomic Energy Association, or IAEA agency officials, convened in Vienna to prepare for a new round of talks to be held in Baghdad. British Foreign Secretary William Hague has already stated that without concrete proposals and steps from Iran, sanctions, quote, will not only be enforced, but over time intensified. Such belligerent language and posturing has laid the groundwork for nearly all talks on Iran's nuclear program. We, the American public, are supposed to swallow that diplomacy, by its regular definition, will lead to a negotiated agreement while preventing greater hostility. However, all we have witnessed is threats of crippling sanctions, with the option of military strikes and war should Iran fail to succumb to Western demands. In 2009, President Obama entered into office with the promise of engagement and diplomacy with Iran. Yet, shortly thereafter, surrounded himself with Clinton and Bush-era politicians that had driven the Iran sanctions agenda in the past, and adopted what was coined a dual-track policy, namely, talks backed by the pressure of sanctions. Following the highly disputed and irregular Iranian elections in 2009, and in the aftermath, the brutal government crackdown against its people, Congress, Israel, and the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, vying for an opening to push forward their hawkish agenda, ramped up calls for sanctions on Iran. The US has not yet tried to couch its call for sanctions and escalation of its war rhetoric in any regard at Iran's countless human rights violations. Yet, knowing full well that sanctions were being considered, leaders of the Green Movement, presidential candidates Mousavi and Karoubi, among other high-profile leaders and activists, publicly opposed the sanctions. Mousavi noted that sanctions would impose agonies on a nation who suffers enough from miserable statesmen, and Karoubi said that he did not agree with any outside pressure and that at the end of the day, the ordinary people would suffer. Israel, however, continued to send out threats of military action, undermining any perceived sincere Obama administration efforts towards negotiations. Further, on the same day talks on the nuclear issue in Geneva with the P5 and Germany began, the House of Representatives adopted new sanctions targeting Iran's gas sector due to increased and persistent pressure from APEC. Iran experts who closely followed the negotiations have stated that the threats of military action render diplomacy meaningless. With sanctions already on the horizon and the military option on the table, the Iranians were weary of negotiations because failed negotiations could lead to war, as we had already seen in Iraq. It is worth noting that in 1970, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, of which Iran is a signatory, went into effect. That same year, Iran's nuclear program began under the Shah, the US-installed authoritarian ruler of Iran at the time, who had the full backing and support of the US for its nuclear program. After the 1979 revolution, the program was stopped and did not reignite until the mid-90s. By 2002, due to the leak of classified Iranian documents, it became apparent that the extent of its program had not been fully disclosed. And the IAEA has since concluded through inspections that Iran had violated its obligations under the Safeguard Agreement of Transparency in the NPT. So what? What does that mean and why does it matter? A classified Defense Secretary Gates memo was released in 2010, wherein he allegedly says that Obama's dual-track approach of diplomacy coupled with pressure from sanctions towards Iran has no endgame. The memo was said to include a series of military alternatives should the White House approach fail. It's a valid question. What is the endgame of this approach? Is it an end to nuclear enrichment? Is it regime change? Is it regime submission? Oil? Is it ultimately what Secretary Gates planned for, military action? Turkey and Brazil, Iran's allies, were able to achieve a deal with Iran, coined the Tehran Declaration, that the US, with its 30-some years of hostility towards the country, was not. The deal was nearly identical to the one being negotiated just months prior by the P5 in Germany, but was dismissed. The ever-blatant world order of double standards and coercion is hardly missed here. There are 4 countries who are not signatories to the NPT: North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Iran faces sanctions and threats of military action for its nuclear program, while Israel has clandestinely developed a nuclear arsenal, and India received a nuclear deal from the US and avoided any commitments towards disarmament. In 2010, at the same time that the US and Israel lobbied for support at the UN Security Council for a new round of sanctions on Iran, the NPT review conference took place. On the agenda of the conference were talks regarding a Middle East nuclear-free zone. The final document of the conference explicitly made the commitment to a regional conference to advance these discussions. Israel's response was that they would not take part in its implementation. Even if we in the anti-war community support a however imbalanced treaty like the NPT, in that it can provide a framework in which governments can work together towards disarmament, this disarmament must include the 5 signatories that have nuclear weapons: the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And any and all negotiations must be free of coercion. We know that nuclear weapons and nuclear energy are dangerous. Japan has recently emphasized that. And Germany led by example when it declared that it would close all nuclear reactors by 2022. I believe that Iran should not seek nuclear weapons, and many of us may believe that they should remain in compliance with an imbalanced and flawed NPT, because frankly, it is better than nothing. It is our role, no, our job as activists, to call for a new framework that does not include false pretexts for sanctions and war, and one that calls for disarmament in our own country and globally. While most sanctions on Iran are aimed at the nuclear program, it is important to highlight those that are not in order to better understand how these distinctions are played out. The sanctions on Iran are unprecedented in only one way. Met with tremendous amounts of advocacy to take human rights crisis in Iran seriously, the Obama administration imposed human rights sanctions in the form of asset freezes and travel bans over a number of Iranian government officials known to be human rights violators. Many Iranians would agree that the head of the Iranian Basij, Revolutionary Guard, and Prosecutorial General are indeed responsible for or complicit in the abuse and torture carried out against the Iranian people. Nevertheless, as activists, many in Havaar also believe strongly and firmly in due process rights for all individuals. We advocate for those on behalf of prisoners denied those rights in both Iran and the United States. We do not believe that it is our role as grassroots activists to support inherently flawed systems that perpetuate inequality, lack of due process, and real democracy. The use of asset freezes in the UN increased after September 11th, when the US put forth a list of 200 individuals to the Security Council Sanctions Committee. The freezes had no constitutional or criminal safeguards, nor did they carry the transparency and notice of any kind of litigation. There's no formal means by which an individual could challenge their appearance on this list, and most strikingly, the government putting forth the names had no requirement to proffer evidence as to why. The International Commission of Jurists issued a report in which it determined that the process of blacklisting was arbitrary, discriminatory, and, quote, unworthy of the UN. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights criticized the blacklisting as lacking in due process. Since then, there have been some very limited reforms, but they do not come close to resolving these issues. The very central reason at the heart of why sanctions are wrong is the unethical and human consequences they carry. It is in this context that we must question their means of application and the very real consequences towards achieving lasting peace and real democracy when we forgo these principles in the process to get there. So what are the human consequences? Hans von Spanek resigned his post as UN Human Rights Rapporteur on Iraq when it became apparent to him that what sanctions were doing, he stated in an interview, I was being misused for a United Nations policy that was punitive, that tried to punish a people for not having gotten rid of their government. Conversely, in the passing of the Comprehensive Sanctions Act in the United States, Congressman Sherman stated in response to criticism that the sanctions could hurt the ordinary Iranian people, quite frankly, we need to do just that. Senator Mark Kirk, who fashions himself a believer in human rights and defender of activists in Iran, sponsored the bill and said his plan was to cause so much suffering among ordinary Iranians that they'll be forced to rise up against the regime, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to war with them. But Iranian wealth and ingenuity at circumventing sanctions have largely insulated it against the economic disruption that the sanctions are intended to bring about. However, this doesn't change the fact that sanctions are aimed at undermining Iran's economy, and the extent that they're successful, their harm will be indiscriminate. We have limited empirical data showing what the effect of sanctions on Iran are, because we saw in the case of Iraq, sanctions take time to erode an economy so severely that you see the 500,000 deaths that we saw over a decade in Iraq. In fact, the aftermath of the first Gulf War, a general was quoted as saying that the airstrikes on infrastructure were intended to speed up the effect of sanctions. We have seen that industries such as airplanes have not been able to purchase spare parts for repair. We know that until recently, internet communication software was banned. However, the US, by imposing restrictions on software and hardware that would enable Iranians to bypass government internet filters, makes it difficult for activists to organize. We also know that sanctions affect the most vulnerable members of society while allowing the government to consolidate its power and resources. The state, the Revolutionary Guard's growing business empire, and quasi-government foundations dominate up to 80% of business in Iran, and most are able to weather the financial storm. Nevertheless, the Iranian government does not want you to know how bad its economy is. For some time, even before the latest rounds of sanctions, Iran has suffered from a high rate of unemployment, inflation, decreased wages, and working conditions. Some economists state that their shift away from a state-run economy to an economy with greater privatization has much to do with this crisis, which contributed to people's ire as many took to the streets in 2009. The Iranian government has downplayed the effects of sanctions, stating that Tehran has reached self-sufficiency in every sector hit by sanctions. Further, where there is criticism or reporting of the economic crisis in Iran, state-run media outlets simply do not mention the sanctions at all. According to the central bank in Iran in 2012, 22.5% of Iranian families were unemployed. Underemployment has been estimated at close to 35%, with inflation at over 20%. The Iran Labor Report received reports from activists that production facilities had been forced to lay off 30% of workers, and those still holding jobs suffer from severe wage decreases. In an attempt to stimulate the economy in the face of the harshest sanctions, the central bank devalued the international exchange rate of its currency, the rial, to increase exports, in essence, making Iranian products cheaper. However, this also had the effect of increasing the cost of imported goods, harming businesses large and small that rely on imported raw materials in their own production. It is reported that the rial declined more than 50% against the dollar in a year's time. Thus, essentials like rice have more than doubled. Goods like milk and paper have increased 20%, and vegetables are reported to have increased 148%. Reports from earlier this year state that Iran has had trouble paying for things like rice, cooking oil, grain, and other goods. Iranian farmers face a shortage of feed for their livestock. Though food shipments are not targeted under sanctions, financial measures have frozen Iranian firms out of much of the global banking system, hindering their ability to buy goods. A businesswoman in the city of Mashhad is quoted as saying, "I'm living day to day. I don't know if we will be able to keep our business or pay our rent in the months. But other people less fortunate than me are worried about feeding their children." Testimonies collected by women's rights activists in Tehran indicate that medicines for illness such as asthma, cancer, and other chronic diseases are either in short supply or completely unavailable or unaffordable. People with life-threatening illnesses such as cancer can no longer afford to pay for their injections, says one pharmacist, so they either delay them or mostly among poor communities, forego them altogether. Everyone who knows someone in Iran has one of these anecdotes. I have been told that based on various reports and shortages from families, they stocked up for fear of short supply, only later to learn that reports were misguided. The sanctions also target the oil and gas industry. 80% of the Iranian government's income comes from the energy sector. The depth and indiscriminate effect of these sanctions are beyond those even anticipated by the governments pushing for them. Just recently, it was reported that the UK said it was in talks with other EU members about possibly easing a provision of their oil embargo before it goes into effect. Essentially, there would be harmful and unintended side effects because it bans Europe-based insurers from covering any ships that carry Iranian oil anywhere in the world. Recently, Secretary of State Clinton failed in convincing India to decrease its consumption of Iranian oil. However, in order to avoid sanctions, both India and China have sought alternative methods of paying Iran for the oil and the delivery. Looking at numbers for people like me who are not economists is not always helpful. I know. It's hard to connect to the reality of what a food shortage looks like, or what it means to not have access to cancer drugs that you need. These are real consequences that Iranians are already facing. What never gets discussed behind the closed doors and back alley negotiations of politicians is what effect these threats have on the overall health of a people. A population of 79 million Iranians are the primary targets, not those in power, of unethical and immoral policies that are intended to drive them to misery so as to change the conduct of the government that many believe does not represent them. Gallup compared a poll from this year and last in which they asked Iranians what their mood was. The number of those that said they were worried much of the day prior shot up to 55% from 38% the year prior. I was lucky enough to spend 2 months in Iraq before the invasion of 2003. In the hotel where we stayed in Baghdad, there was an ever-demure, older, kind gentleman who was an Iraqi ballet dancer before the Gulf War, where he was wounded and could no longer dance. His job was to prepare us and serve tea. Every day, he would come into the dining hall, and he would ask us, "Will there be war today?" The trauma of what constant threat and anxiety that increased sanctions and belligerent threats of war have on people should not be taken lightly. Similarly, we cannot hang back and let the sanctions take their toll on the country over the next 10 years, as many of its advocates would have us do. We have to learn from our mistakes. A minority of people continued the hard work of protesting the sanctions in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. It was not until real threats of a second war arose that many began to learn about and advocate against those policies. But at that point, the war was the solution to lifting the sanctions, the final endgame the United States had ultimately set up.